Bob, it's so great to have you here. Thank you for joining us.
Glad to be here.
This is another in the series of reflections in the history of modeling and theory for the SMTPB Society, the Society for Modeling and Theory in Population Biology. And we conduct these conversations, Bob, in order to give our members, especially our younger early career members, more of an introduction to how the field's changed. What are they entering into? Plus, any pieces of advice you might have for them. I'm really excited to be welcoming Bob Holt with us today. And I know he's influenced both of our work. You dug into his CV a bit. Give us a overview.
Yeah, absolutely. So maybe I'll start with the first time I met Bob. I mean, I know that's probably not a huge line on his CV as such, but it resonated for me. So I met him actually the first talk I gave in ecology at an ESA
Mm.
conference. And he made the point of coming up to me afterwards and saying he liked the talk. And that meant a lot at the time because it was really the first time I was presenting my work to ecologists. So I think he said something like, that was a nice talk for a theory talk. So I took that as a good compliment from him, and and so that stuck with me. And yeah, I've enjoyed seeing him, again at ESA and other events since then. But yeah, way before that, Bob's background is originally in physics. So his
Mm.
undergrad degree was from Princeton in physics, and we might ask a little bit more about whether he was already thinking about mathematical biology at that time. I'm not sure, but it did at least, I guess, by the end of that, lead him into biology because his PhD was in biology from Harvard, 1979. So at least by that point, he was already thinking about some biological questions. So Sally, I don't know if you have other interactions with Bob over the years.
Well, and just, I think he has really shaped my thinking about such things as evolutionary rescue, range expansions. I love the idea of a black hole sink, the idea that there can be, places beyond a range where organisms can't survive, but that kind of continual migration pressure. So that just view of, okay, let's think about not just a single population, but the evolution of a meta community, I think was a really important influence on my thinking. Um, James, did you want to do a highlight of Bob's career?
Yeah. So Sally had mentioned to me earlier that your work on meta communities had been influential on her as well as on many other people. And so I was just looking through some of the highlights in your CV, papers, projects you've worked on, and a few things stood out. So the meta community work, I think, has been extremely influential. It's certainly very highly cited and influenced my work as well. And a couple other areas also stood out. So thinking about the role of apparent competition or indirect interactions, that has been another really influential idea where you may have thought competition always had to be something very direct. Maybe it can be mediated by a predator or a different kind of interaction. And that idea, I think, is very prevalent now today, following on from your work. And third thing I picked out was thinking about ecology, community interactions under global change, or how we fit those two things together. The change in those interactions over time that is inevitable, and that also is just a highlight of your work that I think has been also very influential. And funnily enough, I think those areas are somewhat represented in three book projects that you've worked on as well. So one of those on trait-mediated indirect interactions, another on meta communities, and this is the third book project that I think you were a co-editor of, is Unsolved Problems in Ecology. And so that is just a really fascinating edited volume, curated, I think, by you to a large extent, where some really fascinating ideas. And I think that's one of those things that our viewers might be interested in. What are those unsolved problems still to come? So before we launch into the questions, I just wanted to also give a sense of how eminent in the field you are. And so you have a long list of awards on your CV. Some of the highlights are the Eminent Ecologist Award from the Ecological Society of America. In 2022, you became a member of the National Academy of Sciences. And you've also had numerous awards from disciplinary organizations, the Stool Wright Award from the American Society of Naturalists, the Per Brink Oikos Award in 2014, as well as fellowships of other learned societies. So with that, I think I will hand over to Sally for our first question for Bob.
Bob, when did you first realize that math was a tool that would be useful to provide insights about biology?
It would have been my freshman year in college. So a bit of my personal background, I grew up in Tennessee. We had agricultural roots. We had a family farm, though I grew up in Memphis, not actually on the farm, but I spent a lot of time there. And my parents and grandparents were all interested in natural history. So I became interested in natural history very early on, bird watching in particular, but also wildflowers and so forth. And I was an amateur astronomer as well as a keen birder. And so when I decided where to apply for college, I wanted to go to a place that was really, I wanted to go into physics. And I wanted a place that was really good in physics, but I wanted a place that was also strong in liberal arts, the humanities, because I like literature and music and so forth. And so that's why I went to Princeton, because there I was 18, and it was the most rural of the Ivy League,
Right.
a little town in New Jersey. You could walk out to the country. So I was uncomfortable living in cities then. And it had what is reputed to be the best physics department in the world. I mean, Einstein used to live in Princeton at the Institute he worked at the Institute for Advanced Studies, for instance, and they had a number of Nobel Prize winners and the like. And fortunately, I was able to have a lot of flexibility. I took a lot of AP courses, and I took two college courses, biology and physics. I had college credit for calculus, biology, physics, French. I had my freshman year basically taken care of, and had a lot of flexibility then. And at Princeton, they put me in what's called a University Scholars Program, which allowed me to. I was a physics major, but I could have a lot of flexibility in it. For instance, having advisors who were in other departments. And I had been told even though we were an agricultural family, we had a lot of ties to education. And I had a cousin who was president of the University of Tennessee, and he'd been president for like 18 years, extremely popular president, Andy Holt. And I went to visit him my senior year, and he had a dean show me around campus. In retrospect, it was ridiculous. He called the dean up and says, "Drop what you're doing. I have a cousin you need to show." I didn't realize till many years later that this is pretty. So I went around and met all these senior professors. I didn't talk to these students. But my cousin, he said, when you get to wherever you go, he wanted me to go to UT because that was his school, but he knew I was blind to Ivy League schools. He says, what students should do is go around and meet the professors doing things that they think are interesting. So I thought that's what you were supposed to do your freshman year. So there it was, September of 1969, and I went around and I met physicists and mathematicians and philosophers and biologists. In particular, I met Robert MacArthur, who was the closest thing to an ornithologist in the department, right? He worked on his wood warblers. And so I went in and talked to him, and he was, it turns out that's aberrant behavior for freshmen to go around and talk to a lot of professors.
It shouldn't be, but it is.
But I met MacArthur and Egbert Lee and Henry Horn, who I think came in a little bit later, and John Bonner in biology, all these really great scientists. And MacArthur gave me some papers to read. And so we started communicating. He gave me the classic limiting similarity paper that he'd written with Richard Levins, because MacArthur knew I was going to be a physics major, but I was interested in birds. See, I thought I was going to go into biophysics or something like that. I like neurobiology, something like that. That is very vague in retrospect. But and I came back a week later and we talked about it. And we did that recurrently. He'd give me papers to read. I go off, read them, try to understand them. And of course, these were all papers that used mathematics.
Right.
Differential equations and so forth. And so kind of working through that. And I was taking my freshman year class on differential equations, so it kind of fit right in, you know. And this is kind of before you could really do simulations on computers, except for, you know, on punch cards, right?
Yeah.
But I'd learned a little Fortran, so I was able to do a little bit of that at least. And and I think because MacArthur was there and Egbert Lee was there, who also did mathematical biology, um, that just it seemed to me like a natural tool for thinking about complex systems, and ecology is of course a complex system. Neurobiology is the same way. I was thinking about going to neurobiology, and there also people were starting to use what we now call neural networks and the like to in fact one of my undergraduate advisors in physics was Henry Hopfield, who got the Nobel Prize last year for
Hmm.
because he got interested in neurobiology and wrote a paper on what's now called the Hopfield network in PNAS. I think it's been cited 30,000 times. Okay,
Wow.
it kind of reinvented AI as a field. Um, so so I had this exposure to kind of and I took my sophomore year, so my freshman year in biology, I took animal behavior and sensory physiology, because at Princeton, after your intro course, which I'd already gotten credit for from my senior year, because I took a college course my senior year in high school,
Hmm.
um, you could take any biology course except biochemistry without other prerequisites. Biochemistry, you had to have organic chemistry. So I took organic chemistry the summer between my freshman and sophomore years, and then was able to take the biochem course. So I just took whatever fit my schedule, including these courses full of seniors. I was hanging on by my fingernails, but really fascinating courses on sensory physiology, kind of the root of how do neurons work, you know, what's going on when you actually see something in terms of what happens in the eyeball and so forth, not just in humans, but in lots of organisms. And then Konishi, who ended up at Caltech, really famous animal behaviorist. He's the guy who discovered that owls can navigate using their hearing in completely dark rooms to catch mice and so forth. That was all great. And then I went out to Arizona to take that organic chemistry course. And I was a keen birder, and that's why I wanted to be in Southeast Arizona, because of all these Mexican species there. And I spent every week I volunteered to do field work with biology graduate students because I didn't have a car. So I could get out in the desert and up in the mountains. I
Mm.
shamelessly called the president of the local Audubon Society and wangle invitations to people's houses and scattered places. I was a very shy person, very shy guy, but somehow I wasn't shy when it came to doing something like that. And then I ended up had a little money left over. This all money I'd made throwing newspapers as a teenager. And I said, well, where am I going to go? Maybe I'll go to California, but what am I going to do when I get to LA in a bus station, right? And then I said, Mexico. And there was a book that had come out called Finding the Birds of West Mexico. Peter Alden, who's still alive. He's in his 90s now. And it had beautiful plates of the endemic birds of West Mexico, and then detailed like maps of where you go, where you walk, and so forth. And so I
Hmm.
contacted Alden, and he gave me more details on what I should do. And I took a bus and I camped out down in San Nayarit, Mexico, in the forest, and then went up into Sinaloa, the Durango Highway, which is a very dangerous place these days because of the drug trade and all that. But there I was. I was 19. I'd already experienced, you know, rainforest, mangroves, cloud forest. Really stupid, you know, camping by myself, you know, out in the boonies. But I got then that fall. So I took MacArthur's biogeography course, which he taught with a paleontologist, great paleontologist named Al Fisher. And of course, there was a lot of math in that. And
Hmm.
and I was full of, and MacArthur loved Arizona. And I was full of stories. I was absolutely chock-a-block with stories about the adventures I'd had in the deserts, the mountains, and down in Mexico and so forth. And he liked that. And he gave me an A plus in that course. Okay, because I really got into it. And he invited me on his last field trip, which is my sophomore year, back to Arizona, May of my sophomore year. And it was, you know, him and John Terborg and Jared Diamond and Jim Brown and all these luminaries. And I had the advantage, unlike the grad students who were all terrified of these people. I wasn't actually planning to be an ecologist then. I was going because I wanted to see, the Mexican chickadee in the Chiricahua Mountains. That's why I was on this trip, and just be out in the desert in the mountains for another month. But so I was just extremely lucky in who I got to know early on, who used math. And Henry Horn came in and he did not complicated math, but kind of elegant, simple models of the adaptive geometry of leaves, trees, and so forth. Um, he did some models that were sort of behavioral ecology in nature, having to do with territoriality in birds. Um, and there was, like I said, Egbert Lee was there at the time, and he was doing a lot of model. And he was also an evolution. Both MacArthur and Lee were evolutionary biologists as well as ecologists. So MacArthur he gave me a paper to read on sex ratio evolution, for instance. He was talking about what came to be known as RNK selection and the like. His book, which he published as he was dying in 1972, my senior year, Geographical Ecology, is of course uses lots of relatively simple but elegant and illuminating mathematics to make its messages. Island biogeographic theory, optimal foraging theory, resource consumer models, all that sort of stuff. That's kind of a long-winded answer to your short question.
Well, it sounds like you had a lot of early exposure to that connection between math and bio, and a lot of great mentors that you managed to find your way towards at Princeton. I'm going to move on to a question related to when you got into working on models in ecology and evolution. And so we're wondering if you have a favorite memory of a kind of aha moment where a model helped you figure out something that had puzzled you earlier on.
Yeah, I think I've had several kind of aha moments in my career. I mean, one was actually, you mentioned apparent competition. Kind of think, because I started, MacArthur had some cryptic comments about how predators can affect species coexistence and could sort of mimic competitive interactions that I didn't quite understand. And so I took his resource consumer model, and then I assumed there were multiple resources, each not competing directly, but a generalist predator or generalist consumer eating all of them. And I worked it out. And then I finally realized I could take kind of the algebra and translate it into a graphical form using an isocline, and that I could get a qualitative insight about the indirect interactions at equilibrium between prey species from the shape of the predator isocline, which meant that it applied not just the specific algebra of the model that I started with, but to a much broader range of models that had certain qualitative assumptions. And that was embedded in my very first paper, which was in 1977 in TPB on apparent competition. So that was an aha moment. And I've had others too. So I had one that I'm sort of proud of. I mean, somewhat later, where again, using relatively simple models, I've been interested ever since I was a student. In fact, remember MacArthur had geographical ecology, and he had a chapter on species geographical ranges and understanding range limits, and is, I think, a very interesting aspect of both ecology and evolutionary biology. And in fact, I had an unpublished chapter in my dissertation on ecological models for sharp species borders, which is with a little section on the evolutionary species border problem, which Ernst Mayr had talked about a lot. And where was I going with this? So
The aha
the aha
papers.
moment, yeah. So
Yeah.
then you can strip down all the complexities of the world and say now you're at the edge of a species range, and to understand why it's stable, you have to understand what happens when individuals disperse outside the range. Well, ecologically, they have to have a little r that's negative, which means that they're outside of their niche, basically, right? And they're going extinct. Okay. Well, two things. One is you can say, okay, let's think about the ecology of the system. Let's start out first with a stable source and sink. So everything's fixed in time, but you have a constant flow. And you can work out then the standing crop of individuals in the sink. And then you can say, well, what happens if you allow the growth rate to vary in time in the sink? Okay. Well, it turns out that the time average over, now the population is fluctuating, the time
Yeah.
average increases over what you would expect in a constant environment with the same average growth rate. This is what I called an inflationary effect.
Mhm.
I realized this in the late 1990s. I was at Imperial College as a visitor, and they put me in a room with a bunch of scruffy graduate students, including Andrew Gonzalez, who's now a distinguished professor at McGill. And I was telling Andy about this idea, and he says, "Oh, Bob, I can test it experimentally." He was working with Joel Cohen, who's another great mathematical biologist, who, by the way, was also one of my professors when I went to Harvard for my first year, he and Tom Shaner. So I got a big dose of math bio there. So Joel was very interested in what's the effect of the color of noise on population dynamics, red noise versus white noise versus blue noise, okay? And they had developed a microcosm system with paramecium, where you know what little r is as a function of temperature. And by varying temperature, you could create different colors of noise in the environment and look at the subsequent effects on population dynamics. And they've been doing this for a while with closed populations, but it was very simple. You had a source population and then a sink population where the average temperature led to extinction, but you don't get extinction because you have a recurrent immigration, and then you fluctuate the temperature, and then you use a random number generator, hot, hot, cold, cold, hot, cold, cold, hot, and so forth. And the theory predicted that if you had a positive autocorrelation in growth rates, that greatly magnified quantitatively the inflationary effect. So Andy did that in this experiment where numbers are low enough, you don't worry about density dependence. You have hot, cold, hot, hot, cold, but the air, in a closed population, it goes extinct because the average growth rate's negative. And it worked beautifully. You got this inflationary effect, both with white, a little bit of white noise increases a little bit, and red noise increased it a lot. We got that out as a paper in PNAS because we had some simple theory and an actual empirical demonstration of the effect. And then I had another sort of aha moment related to this, where I said, well, what if the source is sort of an illusion? There are a bunch of habitat patches on average that just like the ones you're looking at, and you're drawing immigrants from them. Will this effect still work? All right. Well, it wouldn't. It obviously would, because you have to have the immigration, individuals leaving someplace. Well, that means that they reduce their capacity to capitalize on, say, runs of good years that allow numbers to inflate. So I wasn't sure if they work, but anyway, we worked out the math in a paper in American Naturalist in 2007, and it worked very nicely. And then Andy, on his own, did a simple metapopulation experiment, 2 sinks fluctuating in time. And basically, if they're fluctuating synchronously, in extinction, but if they're asynchronous and they're sharing immigrants, the whole can persist at a higher level if you have red noise in the environment. Okay, so, and he got that as a lovely just experiment. My name on it in ecology. So time goes on, and the pandemic hits. That's when Sally and Illyrio talked to us. And my first student at Kansas, I was at University of Kansas many years before moving to Florida in 2001, a guy named Greg Glass, who went from small mammal ecology to public health via studies of inner city rat populations and the viruses they carry. And then he got into hantavirus later on. Then he became a faculty member here in our Emerging Pathogen Institute in Geography. He's just retired. At any rate, Greg called. My postdocs were saying, Bob, isn't there something we can do that's intellectually relevant to the pandemic? And Greg right away immediately said, Bob, that stuff you did with kind of fluctuating populations, and with where they're all sinks, is relevant. And the idea is that, let's say you take an SIR model, okay, And now you have, this is before the vaccinations were around. Now you have what are called NPIs, non-pharmaceutical interventions, like masking, like lockdowns and so forth. So, and now let's say you have localities that are each doing on average the right thing. And what happens? You have a lockdown, cases go down, people relax, and it goes back up, okay? But then they're not coordinated in what
Hmm.
they do. Well, what do you have here is you have a potential metapopulation of sinks where the ensemble can persist even though the average growth rate everywhere is negative. Now, I tried to write this as a letter to the editor, to Science and Nature, the Lancet. They said, where's the data? Where's the data? Well, this is an insight, right? But we finally got it in PNAS that fall, and a group in England, a guy named Andy Tatum, who used to be here, and one of our former students, Nick Ruchtenenchoy, who's now at Virginia Tech, published a paper in Science using very detailed models from around Europe, using Google data and phone cell data and so forth to make inferences about movement. And they concluded that the absence of coordination among states and among locations within states greatly contributed to the failure of control of the pandemic. Okay. And now we've just had a paper, the very latest American Naturalist, the March issue, has a special feature that Rachel Germain and Sebastian Schreiber organized, your colleague,
Right.
Sally, on neglected ideas or misunderstood ideas in ecology. And they asked us to talk about this. So we have a paper out in this inflation, bringing out its public health implications, but also
Control.
implications for just understanding how metapopulations work in general, right? And for me, it all started with thinking about the edges of species ranges, which leads to sources and sinks. Um, and anyway, we have a grant now actually where we're with Nick Ruchtenenchoy, we're actually looking at a lot of public health data and multiple diseases simultaneously and so forth. Um, And what did policymakers actually do? Cuomo in New York City had a block by block strategy. Boris Johnson in England had a whack-a-mole strategy. There was very little coordination, and that's a kind of cosmic failure. So for things like pandemics, you of course you think globally, but you got to act globally sometimes too. You can't just act locally in response to local circumstances. So getting back to sources and sinks, another kind of aha moment I had was thinking about evolution. Okay, saying okay, so I talked about when is the sink when is the part of the species range limit ecologically stable is when you have habitat that's outside the ecological niche requirements of the species, where little r is negative. But niches can evolve. So if it's going to be evolutionarily stable, you have to have niche conservatism. You have to have, even though, and so if you have immigration from a source to a sink, you can say, well, we can set that up in a variety of ways. Well, let's strip it down. The simplest is where you have pulses of dispersal followed by a decline with no other dispersal. And so you have independent evolutionary trials. Well, what do you got? You've got the scenario that I coined a term with Richard Gomakaiwas, evolutionary rescue, where you colonize a site and can you adapt fast enough to make it? And if the answer is no, well, that's when you get niche conservatism because you get recurrent colonization, but adaptive colonization never happens, so you never persist without recurrent immigration. Um, and that was also sort of an aha moment because I realized that that was a scenario that was relevant not just to understanding species geographical range limits, but to many other problems in evolutionary biology and ecology. So, such as the evolution of habitat specialization versus generalization. What happens, um, in applied circumstances
Right.
like conservation, where you want evolution to rescue them, or the converse, if you have therapies controlling cancers, you don't want the cancer lineage to evolve to uh, to adapt to the therapy regime being imposed. In fact, I was just down at the Moffitt Cancer Center in Tampa a few weeks ago giving a talk about recent advances in evolutionary rescue theory, because you can turn it around and say, how can you prevent evolutionary rescue of the evolving cancer lineage of cells? Okay,
Exactly.
they're actually trying to use these ideas to refine a therapy, kind of in a dynamic way, almost a game theoretic approach to therapy. And I've had some other aha moments, but maybe those two for now. I mean, those I've given you several, I guess, there. So,
Yeah, there are
It
some good ones.
sounds yeah, it sounds like you've been fortunate to have many of them. Those are wonderful where you start to see a problem in a different way. I'm going to skip to a question that's related to this. And it feels to me like the fields of ecology and evolution were quite separate for the first couple decades of my career and then have become intertwined. But I don't feel like that's true of your work. It feels like it has been intertwined from the beginning. So are we just catching up, or did you feel like something needed to change?
well, in terms of like I said, I was lucky because MacArthur and Egbert Lee, Henry Horn, they were as much evolutionary biologists as ecologists. And then I went to Harvard, and my first year I was stuck right next to Ernst Mayr, who'd been long retired, but one of the great evolutionary biologists of the time. I was down the hall from Stephen Jay Gould. He was on my committee. Um, I hung out with Lewontin's lab group, became good friends with Russ Landy and Jerry Coyne, for instance. And so I was getting a lot of population genetic theory. So it was sort of
Hmm.
in the air. And Richard Levins moved there. And of course, he did a mixture of ecology and evolution. And I just thought it was a natural way to think about things. And I went back, here's my dissertation, actually. And like I said, I ended with the evolutionary species border problem, saying,
Hmm.
let's revisit Mayer's puzzle. Why are species ranges stable when you might expect adaptation to constantly be sculpting them? And then my first, they published actually, I don't know if they let you do this anymore. I actually bound in my dissertation, my first paper, the one on apparent competition.
Yeah.
Ha.
And the last section of it is evolution and apparent competition among prey, where I talk about sort of analogs of character displacement, but in traits related to predation. And I suggest if we are to develop a deep understanding of the relation between coevolution and community ecology, we must develop our evolutionary arguments in the context of explicit population dynamic models. I think that's a reasonable insight.
Yeah.
So yeah, so I've been thinking this way a long time, actually.
I've heard people say in some departments that the dissertation is stapling three papers together. So I think in that case, it literally looks like you were stapling the papers in
It was
there.
totally
So that's a
stapled.
very literal version of that.
Very little.
Um, so that was you. I was you as a student in 1979.
Yeah.
So I'm going to move to a question about students now. So
Uh-huh.
thinking about students entering the field, working in mathematical biology, ecology, evolutionary biology, do you have any advice about how to approach theory and the insights it can provide?
Yeah. One is that students, I really think we need to do a better job at ensuring that students at the undergraduate level and the beginning graduate level get exposed to the range of mathematical and computational tools that you need to actually understand what's going on. I mean, I was extremely lucky. My freshman year, I told you I had differential equations and a linear algebra course, and I took other math courses along the way. Some of them were kind of useless, like I had a modern algebra course, which you need for physics because of group theory, right?
Right,
But
right.
that doesn't come up very often in biology.
Not as much symmetry in ecology as in physics.
Yeah, not as much symmetry. So, and Sally, I basically assign your fat book with Troy to my graduate students to read if they haven't had it, and then I tell them they need to work through it on their own. It's really great for that. Um, that's one thing. Another is to, I have two worries. One is that people are getting more narrow in how they think about the world. and it sort of hyper specialize way too quickly. And I think, of course, you have to become specialized and get really good at something, but you need to ensure that you maintain some breadth in your experience. If you're a theoretician, you ought to take a field ecology course, for instance. Maybe if you're a computational biologist, do something with DNA genomic analyses where you're actually getting the data. I think it's really, really helpful. People don't do enough reading. I mean, I think that students need to, I tell them, hey, you got to read monographs. You got to read the annual reviews because that's somebody who's synthesized hundreds of papers that you won't have to read because you can get the high points this way. And I mean, that's one bit of advice. And then another bit is start writing right away. You don't wait till the end of your dissertation to write it up. You start writing right away. Start trying to publish. Put everything down. And there's no such thing as if you write down a model that seems really simple to you, try to push it as far as you can because even simple models can have interesting insights. So like this inflationary effect. I mean, one thing that I said, I've just discovered something new about exponential growth, which is hard to believe. So, I mean, and I think that that's one problem sometimes is that when people do write down models, they often try to make them pretty complicated from the get-go. And maybe that's where you end up. But I think there are way stations, which are like step stools towards understanding more complex systems of having really simple systems, like a single source in a sink and what's happening there will shed light on the realistic complex spatial geometries or range limits. Everything that's happening there is happening in that complex geometry plus new stuff, right? Oh, let me tell you one other aha moment because you had a question here, and I thought about it. A favorite paper that you wish was better known. So this has to do with. So now we go back to sources and sinks, but then we have back dispersal. So you have selection averaging over both habitats. You still say, when do you get niche conservatism? And I realized there was a deep connection between how you think about that and another arena of evolutionary theory, which is the theory of senescence or aging.
Mm-hmm.
And so I have a paper in Evolutionary Ecology, 1996, Demographic Constraints in Evolution Towards Unifying the Evolutionary Theories of Senescence and Niche Conservatism. Because fundamentally, the way you get something like conservatism is you've got a source in a sink, and the sink's such a lousy place to be. Nobody's there, basically. And when they show up, their reproductive value is so low that when you average over both habitats, selection is biased towards the habitat with greatest demographic weight, okay? Well, that's exactly the same argument that comes up in the evolutionary theory of aging, where the force of selection declines with age in an age-structured species past the first stage of reproduction. Why does the force of selection decline with age? It's because there are fewer old people than young people in a stable population, and they have lower reproductive value. So it's the same idea, okay? And so that means that the same genetic architecture that might underlie senescence, which are they? So this is, say, quoting Michael Rose and what's his name? The famous guy at Stony Brook, G.C. Williams. You have the buildup of deleterious mutations that are age specific in their effect. They don't show up in their effects until later in life. That's one. The other is antagonistic pleiotropy. You benefit reproduction early on at a cost later. Well, you could have exactly the same genetic architecture operating in a spatially structured population where you have deleterious mutations that are only deleterious when they're in the sink, for instance. Okay, or you have a trade-off between the source and the sink, right? It's the same idea. Anyway, that paper it's been cited, I don't know, maybe 130 times. Hanakoko, I was very pleased, picked up on it recently. But that's that, so I have a few papers like that I feel could have, people could have read.
We'll put a link to that paper.
That's right. That's right. Yeah.
Video.
And by the way, it's I shouldn't know if I should admit this, but I view as a public service. I put PDFs of all my papers on my website.
Yeah. We won't tell the
Okay.
publishers that.
Don't
But
tell the
yeah.
don't tell the publishers at least.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Bob, do you feel that the view and the interactions between theoreticians and modelers and biologists has changed over your career?
It sort of waxed and waned.
Mm,
You know, I think there was a fair bit of hostility actually to the sort
Hmm.
of theoretical style of MacArthur back then. Okay, there were, one thing is that there was another side of ecology that did like big systems models, right, with thousands of bells and whistles. Okay, the IBP, International Biological Program, that's the sort of thing they were coming up with. Um, and people were very suspicious of really simple models, which is sort of what MacArthur did, like broken stick model and that sort of thing, right?
Yeah.
But then people kind of got onto it, when David Tillman came around and he kind of pushed along the resource consumer idea. Um, I still think there's a substantial disconnect between a lot of the theory and empiricism often. In the
mhm,
context of conservation, for instance, there's a lot of traction with theoretical population biology, metapopulations, minimum viable population size, but there's not very much with theoretical community ecology
Hmm.
when you
mm,
think about what's needed for species to coexist, okay?
mhm,
And the reason you have problems in the world is maybe species aren't coexisting any longer and some are driving other ones extinct, that sort of thing. Um, and now, of course, there's this sort of big data push, and people sort of think that they can have the computer do the thinking for them. One thing I've noticed in the ecology meetings, I go to the ESA probably every other year, is that there are fewer talks and symposia devoted to theoretical ecology than there used to be. And I'm not sure all the reasons why. And I'm going this summer to Baltimore. I might bring this up as a topic to discuss in the theoretical ecology section, a waning away of interest, and whereas there's been a huge upsurge in kind of applied things and big data sort of stuff, where you use remotely sensed data, you mine the data with AI approaches and all that, all of which is great and valuable. But to me, it's not a substitute. You still need theory as tools of clear thought. Um, I don't know if
I
that,
love that. Tools of clear thought. That's a great quote, Bob.
hmm.
That kind of brings me on to what I think is our last question, and actually goes back in a way to talk about Hopfield in your
Mhm.
undergrad studies, but also what you just mentioned, right? That there are maybe theory looks a bit different, and maybe some things are being missed or changing, and that might not all be for the good, but maybe some of it is. So it could be it could be viewed as a kind of revolution in the way that we approach prediction, statistical
Mhm.
prediction in ecology, drawing on tools, machine learning or AI. So I guess, well, my question is, do you think that theoreticians of the future will use a very different toolkit from what you have used during your career?
How to put it? I think uh, it'll be different. It, it'll be like a nested, like a Russian doll. The
Mm,
interior small Russian doll will always be this kind of classical theory that's based on differential equations and PDEs and so forth. Because I think you need that to understand what's going on. But you have around that, I mean, you don't have to go very far. You go, you know, I coined a term community modules going from instead of going from one, two to infinite to n, a very large number, go from one to two to three to five, small numbers of species interacting strongly. There's a lot of complexities that arise even with three interacting species. You can get rock, scissors, paper kind of, unstable
Yeah,
dynamics, and so forth. Um, and um, and going beyond that, it's actually very hard to make much headway analytically. You almost have to do things that involve the deft use of computer simulations. And if you want to tie it to data, I mean, we're probably going to have to use AI and all kinds of things that were not part of the toolkit of us growing up in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. Okay. And I don't think that's a problem necessary. It's just that, oh, I've got a cartoon somewhere around here about AI. Our campus has a big push on it. We've hired a couple of hundred faculty across campus who use AI.
Wow.
We've got a big building.
Hmm.
This is an old American scientist cartoon, and it shows two people looking at an old computer monitor, and one of them says, "Well, there's artificial intelligence. I guess there's artificial stupidity too."
Ha.
Because that's the thing, how do you know that what you're getting is cogent, makes sense? The only way you do it is you got to think through it, okay? And that's hard, but that's why I think we're always going to need theoretical ecology and evolutionary biology as kind of a foundation for understanding what's going on.
To strip it down to simpler systems that you understand that little internal doll
Right,
insight. Thank
right.
you so much, Bob. Is there anything else that you would like to share about influences over your career?
Well, I've just been extremely, I mean, one thing I'm really glad I did was I had a diversity of going back to my undergraduate and graduate days. When MacArthur died, I could have gotten a physics advisor like Hopfield, okay, to do a
Hmm.
biophysics project, but instead I got John Bonner, who's a great evolutionary developmental biologist, became famous for cellular slime molds. And I wrote a senior thesis. It's 150-page long. It was a library. I tried to do some experiments. I'm a really bad experimentalist. I break stuff, cut myself, on the evolution of multicellularity, talking about things like levels of selection, and there's a lot of fascinating natural history. And so, and I was I was a physics major, but I did field work every summer. We had a project with Tom Givnish in the Pine Barrens in New Jersey. We actually got NSF funding as undergraduate, which is kind of weird, but true. NSF used to do that. I spent a summer in Oaxaca and Chiapas doing field work on cactus, adaptive geometry of cacti. And I got to Harvard. They accepted me without an advisor. So I shopped around for advisors and I took courses from people who I thought were interesting. I took courses with Bob Trivers. I took courses in philosophy and math, economics, a guy named Schelling who ended up getting the Nobel Prize in economics. He wrote a fantastic book, speaking of sort of computer models. It was called Micro Motives and Macro Behavior. He was one of the first people to do what we call individual-based or agent-based models to understand, for instance, the development of segregational patterns in residencies in cities based upon simple rules, behavior rules that people had. And I had Gould, as I said, great paleontologist on my committee. I made myself be exposed to a lot of things, and I wish students would do that more. Take courses from, I took a social insect course from E.O. Wilson. He did it every 3 years. And I wasn't planning to work on social insects, but I said, he's one of the greatest biologists around. I should hear it from the horse's mouth. And he told us at the start of the course, he says, if you want to get an A in the course rather than a B, you have to teach me something I don't know about ants.
That would be a tall order, I think.
And I did. I found something he didn't recognize about ants, which is that there's a lot of hidden polygyny thing. Polygyny is having more than one queen. And there were all these old paper, like 1930s ecology, where you get a paper published in ecology if you dug up 200 ant colonies and just describe the contents. And 5% of the ant colonies would have two or more queens in them in a lot of these papers. And so he and Holdover actually ended up doing a lot of work on polygyny in ants. So I felt proud about that.
Nice.
At any rate, I'm glad I got exposed to that because I learned a lot of natural history, a lot of just facts about the world that are really fascinating, and termites, ants, and bees are incredibly important ecologically. So
That's such
that's
great
one,
advice.
huh?
Yeah. That's such great advice because especially in this publish or perish type of environment, it feels like if I don't just specialize and focus on exactly what's in front of me, then I'll never get anywhere. But I think what you're saying and really rings true is actually in the longer term, you're not going to get anywhere unless you have those ideas and those understanding of different biological systems that allows you really a richness of connections between everything from epidemiology to ecology to evolution to species ranges. What,
Absolutely.
yeah.
So just as a final thought, so this is a metaphor. So think of your life, including your professional life, as a journey where you're walking. There are two ways you can make a journey. You can constantly be looking at your feet. And you got to look at your feet a lot of the time. You don't want to trip over roots or fall into a hole or step on a snapping turtle. But you need to look up and look around and see what the landscape is and have some idea of the destination and then realize that, hey, maybe I can go this way rather than the way I was planning because it looks pretty interesting over there. There's a pretty cool vista. So I think you need to give yourself the mental tools to see the broader landscape in which your specialized work is carried out.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. That's a great place to end. Thank you, Bob.
Well, my
Thanks,
pleasure.
Bob.
My pleasure.